Chapter 1, Mentality and Perspective. How we see and think about the game is going to dictate what we do in the game. So if we're not thinking about the right things, we're not going to do the right things. And if we go one step further, if we're not thinking like a challenger, we're not going to play like a challenger. So the first and most pertinent question is this: what's the goal of the laning phase? Now I'm sure most, if not all of us, can answer this one. It's to win lane. Now winning lane may come in its various forms. For example, a Kayle winning lane is going to look different to a Draven winning lane. But the funny thing here is that lots of players don't even ask themselves this question. Instead, they ask themselves, how do I win this game? And then they talk about everyone else in the game like they're 5v5ing for all of it. The truth is this: you are in a 1v1 or 2v2 for 95%, if not 100% of the game. For example, if a game lasts 30 minutes, how much of that time are you actually 5v5 team fighting for? Not much at all, right? You might be a top laner, and you're thinking more about the enemy AD carry, let's say, than you are the enemy top. You will rarely interact with that enemy AD carry, so why all the stress? To simplify this, look at the formula below. Win lane equals win game. Like, this is not a meme. It's really that simple. If you don't try to win lane, you are playing the game based on hope. You will rely way too much on your teammates, and your win rate will never be above 50%. So the first actual step that you need to apply starts in champ select in the loading screen. In your future League of Legends games from this point onwards, you care about nothing but beating your lane opponent. That's it. If you don't have the intention of crushing your enemy, there's zero chance it will actually happen. So the exercise that will help you activate this new way of thinking is very straightforward. In your next 10 games, I want you to write or type about how you're going to win lane. The greater detail you go into, the better. So think about level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 6. Think about the enemy champion summoner spells. Do these mean anything? What about their runes? What about their abilities? Keep writing or typing until your brain is empty. Then, after that game, I want you to write about everything you remember during the laning phase. If you got a kill, why and how did you get a kill? If you died, how and why did you die? Did you use your abilities as well as you could have? Try to figure out why the opponent has a better score or a worse score than you. Again, write or type until the think tank is empty. And don't worry, it might be hard to answer some of these questions right now, but the answers to those questions and many more are about to reveal themselves. And just a fun fact, when I look at a player's match history, the first thing I look at is their lane opponent's score. I don't care if that player won or lost. I care if that player won or lost lane. You can do this in your games too. Now, the last point I just want to quickly make here will help you in terms of playing the game at the highest level. League of Legends is all about two things: gold and experience. If you are making decisions that maximize your golden experience and minimize your opponent's golden experience, you will be challenger. Everything we are about to talk about is geared towards creating the biggest golden experience gap possible between you and your opponent. Continue to Chapter 2 only once you have completed the Chapter 1 exercise. Chapter 2, Cooldowns and Abilities. Every champion in the game has a passive, a range of basic abilities, and an ultimate. One of the big reasons why challenger players are challenger is because of how and when they use these cooldowns. Now, I am assuming you have a basic understanding of the champion or champions you play, so I'm not going to go through each champion in the game because I'd be dead before I get that done. But in my opinion, what's more important than your own abilities is your ability to track your opponent's cooldowns. So it's like you can see their HUD on your screen itself. So to all top laners, do you know the cooldown of Garen's Q? To all mid laners, do you know the cooldown of Yasuo's Q? To all AD carries, do you know the cooldown of Caitlyn's Q? To all supports, do you know the cooldown of Blitzcrank's hook? Now, if you're an AD carry, you should also know support cooldowns too, and vice versa. But the point I'm making here is that not many players know the exact timer of these popular abilities. High elo players generally have a good understanding, but occasionally even they have no idea. Knowing the timers of your enemy's abilities is the first step to crush lane. You will know the enemy champion better than themselves. So the first exercise of this chapter is an easy one. Exercise number 1. In your next 10 games, write down the name of the champion you're playing against, or champions if you're an AD carry or support. Then next to their name, write down the timer of each of their cooldowns. You can use this website lolwiki, and for example, if we were talking about Samira, you might put passive 0 seconds, Q 65432, W E R, and then at the end I want you to put a key ability. This key ability makes or breaks the champion for the most part. Like with this, they are Samira. Without this though, they are a shade of their stronger self. For example, Samira without her W is a lot easier to kill and exploitable than Samira with her W. Exactly the same thing could be said for Syndra without her E, Fizz without his E, Azed without his W. Hopefully you get my point here. So key ability at the end as well. Do this in the same document. What you're essentially building is a database of cooldown knowledge and awareness. Now I know I said do this in your next 10 matches, but do this in every single one. That should be pretty straightforward, but now we're going to turn it up a notch, and this is where you will feel the power. Exercise number 2. In your next 10 games, say out loud when the enemy uses an ability. and its timer. And just be careful because your mum or dad or siblings, they might think you're crazy. But yeah, for example, when the enemy Syndra uses a Q, you would simply say Q 7 seconds. If you want to be even more efficient, you can say the ability in just a number, indicating the cooldown length. So with the same example, Q7. If we look at a real example here, and I actually did this exercise with Sam, who's a student, it's like he instantly realized how he should have been playing. So he's playing Set, and the enemy Vladimir uses his Q. So if we play this again, we would say Q 9 seconds or Q9. And if we then count down that cooldown, 9, 8, 7, 6, you can just feel how much time you have to take advantage of the enemy being on cooldown, or in other words, the enemy being a weaker champion. Vocalizing this information is vital. It forces you to focus on what's important, your opponent, and by doing so, you will see opportunities that most will not. More on this in the next chapter, of course, but for now, just voicing the cooldown and its timer is more than enough. Also do this in every game, by the way, guys, so I know I said your next 10, but every game you should be doing this until it becomes second nature. Now, as far as your own cooldowns go, for the final part of this chapter, I want to address some bad habits lots of players have, even in higher elos, when it comes to using their own cooldowns. The first one is this: just because you have your own abilities ready to use, this doesn't mean you just use them. Lots of people get a bit too keen on the trigger and pull it when they can actually exert more pressure by just holding it. So check this out. Hooper, a challenger AD carry, goes for a max range Caitlyn Q against a mobile time Kenshin Jin. This is very unlikely to hit, and it's a lot better if he just holds onto it and waits until Jin goes for a last hit maybe, or when his support Karma lands her Q and the enemy champion or champions are slowed. Another bad tendency players have is to use their auto attacks or even abilities on minions, and by doing so you don't use them on the enemy champion. So when I coached Tyron, the Victor you're watching, when I saw him queuing minions and not the enemy Yasuo, I pointed out to him that we were missing out on maximizing our trading pan, in other words, the damage we're dealing to our opponent. Another example I can give is this one. FD is a master Riven main, and instead of just leaving this ranged minion and saving his first Q for Warwick potentially, he just wastes it going for a last hit he did not even need to go for. Just because a minion is last hittable, that doesn't mean you have to kill it straight away. So what I want you to do, I don't even want you to play the game. I want you to download your last 10 ranked games. You are going to go through the early laning phase of each one. What you're going to do is pause the replay whenever you see yourself use an ability. Now ask yourself if it does anything. Does it pressure the enemy champion in any way? If it does, great. If it doesn't, then it's a waste. The goal of this exercise is to focus on why you are using your abilities. Remember, you are thinking about denying your opponent as much as possible, which goes back to chapter 1. So use your abilities when the opponent is going for a last hit. Use your abilities when your teammate has landed their CC. And just one more example to really drive this home, and this is Claire, a mid laner who's been rank 1 multiple times on the Oceanic server. Just because he has his Shroud ready to use, does that mean he should use it? No, we have to have a denying reason to use our abilities. So when he uses his Shroud, is he denying anything from Liss? A bit of space in the lane, but that means nothing here, because we're not denying golden experience. He can use it a few seconds later to pressure Liss when she moves up to last hit these minions. In other words, when she wants her own golden experience. So here we're after quality, not quantity. Continue to chapter 3 once the chapter 2 exercises have been completed. Chapter 3, trading pans. So we are focusing on our opponent and beating them. We are focusing on their cooldowns and counting them and using our own with a purpose, but how do we actually use our own abilities together? How do we combo? Well, the best combos are defined by damage dealt. So if you're getting the most amount of damage possible out of a situation, you are comboing like a challenger, and that's for every role in the Rift. So this example is from a coaching session I did with a Master Riven player, and there is a big difference between how they trade compared to a challenger Riven player. Now, if I just let this play, can you spot the mistake? The mistake is they use 2 cooldowns, but don't auto attack. Yes, Camille wanted to last hit this minion, but Riven's positioning should be a lot closer so she can auto attack first and create more DPS. There is no auto attacking, and especially for a Conqueror stacking champion like Riven, and given what her passive does, this is suboptimal a lot of the time. So the timing was fine, but the execution, the DPS, was lacking. But what about if you're an AD carry? I mentioned that most of your damage is going to come from your auto attacks, so keep it that way. Using your abilities is sometimes a bait. So if we look at Hooper, who we looked at earlier, in this situation, all he has to do is auto attack while moving with the Nautilus. Using his E and Q like this, yes, his Q deals decent damage, but why? We can achieve the same thing without wasting our abilities and therefore mana. And if we did just auto attack, we would have our abilities to then pressure the Draven, who's on his own. So the exercise to discover DPS is to simply go through your last 5 ranked games, and each time again you use an ability or multiple abilities, did you deal the maximum amount of damage possible? The answer might be simple. I should have started that trade with an auto attack, or it might be a bit more complex. Even even though I used my Caitlyn combo, I could have just saved my E and Q and dealt the same damage with auto attacks. After doing so, you should see a pattern developing in how you trade. Now, one other pattern I want to point out is the 3-second rule. So just because you're on cooldown, it doesn't actually mean you're on cooldown, which sounds a little bit weird, but the reason why is because fights last at least a few seconds most of the time. So if the fight is going to last 5 seconds, you can start a fight when your cooldowns technically are lower than 5 seconds, because you will have them up at the end of the fight or sometime during it. And I've got 3 examples for this. This is going to be great. So 2 examples are from master players, and 1 example is from a challenger. Number 1, Nick on Nautilus is on cooldown for a few seconds, his Q. And the problem, if he just stands back, is that the enemy champions will know his Q is back up because they should be counting cooldowns as well, and probably will be. So as soon as Nick sees the Karma use Q, and his Q is now on a 3-second cooldown, he runs towards the enemy bot lane with an on my way ping. This trade wins them the early lane. Number 2, so Zac the Aatrox, he's against a crazy Garen player who uses his Q to last hit this minion. Now, even though Zac's Q is about to come off cooldown, he doesn't do anything about it, and he just chills. This was a big missed opportunity. Number 3, Luhan is a Riven main, and in this situation has a clear HP advantage over Camille. Now, when his cooldowns come down to 3 seconds, and I think this is the best example, he should be looking to fight Camille. If Camille was to hook shot off this wall and engage on the Riven when her cooldowns are 3 seconds or less, the Riven will retaliate, and there is a big kill threat here because she'll have her cooldowns back up very soon. Now, after watching all of those, which one do you think was the challenger? Nick the Nautilus was, yes. So similar exercise here. In your last 5 ranked games, pause the replay each time you see your abilities on 3-second cooldowns. Where are you standing? Is it too far back? Are you even thinking of fighting at this point? Why are you running away? There are other factors we have to consider before just running into the enemy champion for sure, and we will get into those soon. But the goal here is just to open your mind to the potential of the 3-second rule. Now, another pattern that you have to be aware of in any matchup is countering. Basically, this just means your champion with their abilities hard counters the enemy champion and their abilities. But it's important to be really specific here. For example, in this matchup, Set versus Sion, and this is Sam the Set player again, Set can counter one of Sion's abilities. So when Sion charges his Q, if Set is actually in range, he can use his Face Breaker to disrupt Sion's Q. In essence, this means you are fighting 3 cooldowns against 2 all the time, before level 6 anyway. Other examples might include Gragas's Body Slam, countering Jax's Leap Strike, or Ezreal's Arcane Shift, countering Blitzcrank's Rocket Grab, or Yasuo's Wind Wall, countering Fizz's Chum the Waters. The list is close to endless, so it is imperative that before you land on Summoner's Rift, you ask yourself, do any of my abilities interrupt, disrupt, or just counter the enemy champion's abilities, and also, do the enemy champion's abilities do the same to mine? If yes, then type these in a notepad or some sort of file as you're loading into the game and play the lane with these counters in mind. Do this in your next 5 ranked games. Now, another detail to be aware of in regards to trading patterns, what a chapter this is legit damage versus fake damage. Now, legit damage is when you actually hit the enemy champion where it hurts their HP bar. Fake damage is when you deal damage to the enemy champion when it won't hurt. So specifically, when they have a shield protecting their HP. This happens all the time because so many champions have shields. So if we look at this lane from before, Tara and the Victor against the Yasuo, if Victor was to use his Q on the Yasuo right now, why is it bad? Well, Yasuo has his shield charge, and because Victor's Q and empowered auto attack will deal more damage than just his standard basic auto attack, we would be wasting these on a shield. So what Tyrant does is perfect. He procs Yasuo's shield with an auto attack, and we can now deal legit damage to our opponent. Most of the time, these shields will be the cuck between you killing your opponent and not. So it's very important to time your abilities and therefore damage when your opponents don't have them. Other examples include Orianna using her Command Protect, Riven using her Valor, Lulu using her E. There are a bunch of them. So in your next 5 ranked games, I want you to type down the shields the enemy team has. This will help you choose when you should use your abilities, and therefore you are going to maximize your trading potential. Now, the last detail, guys, to be aware of are the runes your opponent is running. These have a massive influence on how you trade. For instance, keystones like Conqueror and Lethal Tempo are great for extended trades. So against certain champions like Jax with Lethal Tempo, Darius with Conqueror, Caitlyn with Lethal Tempo, you have to be careful of fighting to the death because you will most likely lose unless you're running one of those keystones yourself. Whereas if you're running something like Grasp the Undying or Press the Attack, these are short trading keystones. Press the Attack is 3 auto attacks, right? Grasp the Undying charges up when you start fighting and then ends very quickly. So these are centered around short and quick trades. So also make note of the runes you and your opponents are running as well. Chapter 4, Lane Variables. So when you go in for a trade, we're not just taking into account the enemy champion's cooldowns and our own. There are other things in the lane that inform our decision on when to trade and when not to. These are lane variables. So what are they? Well, they include, and I will elaborate on each of them, HP. How many hit points do both you and your opponent have? mana, or energy. How many abilities can you and your opponent use? Unless, of course, the champion is something like Riven or Zac. Items. Who has spent more gold? You might come back to lane with another longsword, but what about if the enemy AD carry already has a noon quiver? What about if they have no health pots? What about if they have no corrupting potion charges left? Levels. Who is the higher level? Who is about to hit a higher level? Minions. Who has the bigger wave? Summoner spells. These are cooldowns and should be treated as such, but do they have 2 combat summoner spells or 1? Does the enemy AD carry have cleanse? Does their top laner have TP? Champion numbers. Are you getting a jungle gank? Is the enemy jungler topside? Is the AD carry on their own and you and your support can quickly 2v1 them? So the most important factor in any lane is HP, the health of you and your opponent. Now there are 3 HP circumstances, and there are going to be 3 for most of these lane variables. So number 1, you have more HP. This should encourage you to look for trades even more, and when you have a lot more HP, even a bad trade can be good for you because the enemy champion will still be closer to dying than you will be. Number 2, you have the same HP. If this is the case, then you think about the other variables, because HP is even. Number 3, you have less HP. This should discourage you from trading if everything else is even. Next factor is mana or energy. Again, there are 3 circumstances. Number 1, you have more mana or energy. This should encourage you to trade. Number 2, you have the same mana or energy. Then you think about the other variables because mana is even. Number 3, you have less mana or energy. This should discourage you from trading if everything else is even. Then we have items. Number 1, if you have the stronger items, this should encourage you to trade. Number 2, if you have the same items, like a level 1, then you think about the other variables. Number 3, if the enemy has stronger items, this should discourage you from trading if everything else is even. Now what about levels? Well, number 1, if you are the higher level, especially in the early game, this should encourage you to trade. Remember, levels increase your base stats because your stats scale per level, like your armor, attack damage, magic resist, etc. So even trading against a level 4 champion as a level 5 champion, you should hard win that trade. Also, you will have an extra ability in the first few levels, because levels 1, 2, and 3 technically represent 3 cooldowns, and then a level 6 because this represents your ultimate ability. Number 2, if you are even in levels, then you think about the other variables. Number 3, if you are behind in levels, this should discourage you from trading. But number 4, what about if you are about to hit a higher level or the enemy champion is about to hit a higher level? Well, if you are about to hit level 2 and the enemy champion will still be level 1, you obviously would want to fight if everything else is even. But if they are about to hit level 6 and you will still be level 5, you obviously want to chill. So the burning question is, when do we hit these levels? Well, there are 3 timers I want you to keep in mind. Now for mid and top lane, these are the timers. The first is the first melee of the second wave. Say this 10 times. First melee, second wave. First melee, second wave. This is level 2. So when that second wave comes to the lane, the first melee minion that dies, I want you to see level 2 above its head. But this is from both sides of the lane. Remember, the opponent can hit these levels before you as well, so look at your minions, not just the enemy minion. And just a quick point here about level 2, guys. If there are 2 range minions that carry over from the first wave into the second wave, and the first melee dies before these, that champion will still be level 1. If there is only 1 range minion that carries over and the first melee of the second wave dies, that champion will still hit level 2. Now the second timer is the second melee of the third wave. Say this 10 times, this is level 3. A good tip, and you can apply this before you hit these levels, is to hold on to your cooldowns just before you hit them. Because when you hit level 3 against a level 2 champion, you would rather have 3 abilities ready to use rather than not, right? But there are some nuances here. If you're playing a control mage in the mid lane like Victor, at level 3 you might think of putting 2 points in your E and using it after you hit level 3 with 2 points in it instead of 1 for more damage. You can do the same thing playing Azir with his Q, Lux with her E, Jace with his Q, Gangplank with his Q. There are a lot of examples. Now the third timer is 5 minutes 30 seconds. Say it 10 times. This is the wave on which you will hit level 6 in most games. This is the third cannon wave, and providing you haven't missed that many minions up until that point, level 6 should be after the first few melee minions, and there's a high chance of it being hit after the cannon minion on that 5 minute 30 second wave. You can obviously apply that same tip here, just before you hit level 6. Save your abilities so you can use 4 cooldowns against 3. Now for bot lane, it's a little different here. The first timer for level 2 is the third melee of the second wave. Say it 10 times. For level 3, the second timer here is the third melee of the fourth wave. Say it 10 times. Pretty easy so far because it's just the third melee of the second and fourth waves. The third timer is 8 minutes. Now a lot more can happen in these 8 minutes, right, in terms of getting experience from kills, objectives, jungle camps even, but generally speaking, an AD carry and or support will be hitting level 6 around this time, so pay attention. The easiest way actually just to time this level 6 is just to time 2 minutes after they hit level 5. Again, this will generally be the time an AD carry and or support hit level 6. Then we have minions. So the first situation is if you have more minions. This should encourage you to trade. Number 2, if you have the same amount of minions, like at the start of the first wave, then you consider the other variables. Number 3, if your opponent has more minions, this should discourage you from trading. Now next up we have summoner spells. Number 1, if you have more summoner spells, this should encourage you to trade, and this applies to every summoner spell combination. Number 2, if you have the same amount of summoner spells, then you take into account the other variables. Number 3, if your opponent has more summoner spells, this should discourage you from trading. Now there is one trick you have to be aware of when there is teleport in your lane. Having TP pretty much means you have 2 health bars, because you can get as low as you want, and then just TP back like nothing happened. This is extremely OP when your opponent does not have TP. You can look for good trades, and when they are below 50% HP, and this is generally speaking again, you can recall, providing you have decent gold, and just TP back and hard bully them out of lane. They will miss a lot of minions after you make that play. Now last up we have champion numbers. So if you have more champions closer to or in your lane, this should encourage you to trade. For example, Gumayusi and his support see the enemy Ashe support in the mid lane. This means that the enemy Xayah is on her own, so if they fight, they have almost double the cooldowns, and it should be hard winning. This is why they start a fight and hard win it. Notice as well that the enemy Xayah uses flash, which means that when Gumayusi has his flash back up, he will have that summoner spell advantage. Lots of these lane variables will overlap each other, and you will see multiple at a time. If you have the same number of champions closer to your lane, then you focus on the other variables. But number 3, if there are more enemy champions closer to your lane, this should discourage you from trading. For the most part, this is referring to junglers, and this is where we get the term strong side and weak side. The strong side of the map is simply the side of the map, top or bot, your jungler is playing towards. The other side of the map is the weak side because your jungler is playing away from that lane. Sometimes you have to be careful of other enemy champions moving towards your lane. For example, the enemy top lane Pantheon might be level 6 and he's thinking of ulting the mid lane out of base. Or the enemy Pyke hasn't shown on the map and as an AD carry, your Sketty might gank you like a jungler would. Or Twisted Fate just hit level 6 and is in fog. Top and bot lanes have to play a bit more carefully. There are a ton of examples, but just being aware of who is showing on the map and who is not showing is big info. Chapter 5, Positioning. This chapter is all about where to stand in your lane. Way too many players just autopilot their positioning and they die way more than a player who's actually thinking about it. So what is positioning? Well, most players, and you might be one of them, stand in the middle of their lane. And this is for every lane. Now, why is this bad? Well, you have to understand that your lane comprises Summoner's Rift. It is part of its geography, and because of this, other influences on this geography can impact your experience. So I'm going to talk about each lane individually here. So you can skip to the lane that relates to you, but some of these tips will overlap, and I think it's still important to have a knowledge of each lane regardless of the role you play. So what determines where you stand? Well, the first big factor is the enemy jungler's position. If the enemy jungler is bottom side of the map, as a mid laner, you're going to hold the top side of mid lane. If the enemy jungler is top side of the map, as a top laner, you're going to hug the top brushes. If you're an AD carry, and you can sniff that disgusting jungle stench, you're going to want to stand away from the brushes you don't have warded. We'll go into even more detail here very soon, but obviously the burning question is, how do we know where the enemy jungler starts, or is? Well, there is something on everyone's screen that gives information on the jungle, the minimap. So whenever you want to know where the enemy jungler is, your best bet is to look at that square in the bottom right or left if you came from Dota, and try to figure it out. So let's keep it simple. As minions are about to enter your lane around 130, the enemy jungler's first buff is about to spawn. So what you have to do at around the 130 minute mark is look at the map to see which lane shows first. Will it be the enemy top laner or enemy bot lane? If the enemy top laner shows first, the enemy jungler has probably started bot. If the enemy bot lane shows first, the enemy jungler has probably started top. This, by the way, is your first exercise for this chapter. In your next 10 games, say out loud where the enemy jungler starts, top side or bot side. Creating a mental note of this information is a must. But what about if it's 5 minutes into a game and you have no idea where the enemy jungler is? Well, you have two options, and you can even do both if you want to. You can either 1, place a ward to protect yourself, and or 2, play safe until you see the enemy jungler show, or even until your jungler is near you, because you might hard win the 2v2 or 3v3 that might happen. Now, another concept I want to get into here is staying parallel. You guys have to understand that when you're not dealing damage to a champion, it's probably because you're behind them or chasing them. So one thing you guys can do to maximize your damage, especially when your cooldowns might be close to coming back up, is you want to maintain your range and actual contact with the enemy champion. So this Alistar's support, for example, when he engages onto this Xerath, he's going to stay parallel the whole time. This actually gives him a great chance, if the Xerath doesn't flash, to reuse his cooldowns at the end of this on the Xerath who he is maintained range with. If he was to keep auto-attacking the Xerath, he's going to be so far behind him, and Xerath might even be out of range of Alistar's next combo. Now, the last concept in terms of positioning is understanding stepping stones. Stepping stones, guys, really relate to those champions like Aurelia, Yasuo, who can use minions in terms of mobility. So if you're playing against one of these champions, standing in the middle of the wave is probably really troll, because they can use these minions as stepping stones to create a way to get onto you. So standing away from the wave for the most part is an excellent technique. Be very careful about sitting on top of these minions when the enemy champion can dash towards them. Chapter 6, Spacing. Spacing is pretty much this: how close you are standing to the enemy champion's range. So pretty much the space from you to them. Stand too close and you are in danger of taking free damage. Stand too far away and you miss opportunities to damage them yourself. But space perfectly and you give yourself the best chance of winning every single trade. Now, one of the best ways to master the art of spacing is to envision the range of your own champion and then the enemy champion. Now, this doesn't just mean auto attack range. If you play against a Scion, you're not worried about his auto attacks, you're thinking about the range and width of his Q. If you're playing against a Blitzcrank, you're not worried about his auto attacks, you're worried about his Q. For example, Syndra's range on her Q is 800. Victor's range on his Q is 600. These abilities both have greater range than their auto attacks, so this is what both players have to space. So for Syndra, if she keeps Victor just outside of his Q's 600 range, she should be able to damage him for free. This is exactly what Chovy does in this game, and without getting horny, this is one of the most beautiful skills in the game. Can you see how Chovy deliberately stalls one of his auto attacks because he knows that Victor can quickly close this space and Q him? So he stops his auto attack and moves away from Victor. In other words, he recreates that ideal space between the two champions. This then allows him to Q the Victor for free. If we look at this example, this is Zhao Qiaomeng, a top laner on the Chinese super server. The matchup is set against Jax. Now, playing against Jax, you have to be aware of his stun from his E, his counter-strike. So you can see how Zhao Qiaomeng, after auto-attacking, always clicks backwards, making sure he has space between him and his opponent. This means that when Jax does use his E and runs its set, the set has already created enough space to avoid the stun. Beautiful. And another Zhao Qiaomeng example, because I'm such a big fan of this guy, this time on Gangplank against Darius, but focus on the Darius. He knows Gangplank started E, so he has to play this lane envisioning Gangplank's range if he used 2 barrels. This allows him to avoid this double barrel combo. It's just perfect. Now, playing on this spacing threshold, I like to call it, which is pretty much maintaining the perfect distance between you and the enemy champion, will get you killed. As Gumayusi just illustrated, you're playing so close to perfectly, but one overextension, one misclick, you are in grave danger. But do you know why Guma will win most of his lanes in Challenger career, and 100% of them in any elo below that? Because he spaces with this intention. We are spacing to create a gap between us and our opponent. So your exercise for this chapter is to go through the first 10 minutes of the last ranked game you played. I want you to imagine a circle around your champion that indicates your range, and a circle around the enemy champion that indicates their range. In other words, damage range. Now, the task here is quite simple. Are you standing as close as you possibly could to the enemy champion's circle? Of course, if the other lane variables, which you've already talked about, are not even, then you're not going to push the spacing threshold as much. You should probably chill a little bit more. But when all else is even, especially when you have the advantage, are you standing in Narnia? The next task to really accelerate this development is to play your next 10 games, and these can be any type of game against bots, ARAM, 1v1, ranked game, normal games, and I want you to look at the enemy champion the entire time. What you will learn is that your peripheral vision will control your own champion. You don't actually have to be looking at them to space well. What you do have to do, though, is look at the enemy champion. You should be able to feel and notice an improvement very quickly. You damage the enemy champion more, and you are actually punishing their mistakes. Chapter 7, Wave Management. Making decisions around minions is a key skill in League of Legends because they represent golden experience. And that's what wave management is. Your ability to recognize the pattern of the minion waves and then deciding what you want to do with that pattern. So the first step in understanding how to manage minion waves at the highest level is to define what is actually happening with the minions in your lane. So the possible wave states are as follows. Reset. A reset wave is this picture, and yes, this is level 1 because this is the most salient of examples. There are the same number of minions on both sides, and both minion waves are outside of tower range. Pushing away. This is simply when your minions outnumber the enemy minions. This will result in the wave pushing away from your tower and towards the enemy tower. Now, this can also happen off waves that collide into your tower. So if you watch this, the friendly minions are building up and building up into a big wave because the enemy minions are clogging the lane. There is no breathing room. It's like a cork in a bottle of champagne. But when that cork releases, the champagne comes flying out. Same in this situation, just a little slower and less dramatic. Now, pushing into. This is just the opposite to pushing away. The enemy minions outnumber your minions, and as a result, the wave is pushing towards your tower. And again, this is the same example, but just from the other side of the lane. Whenever you see your minions holding up enemy minions, the wave will slowly push back to you. Frozen. A frozen wave is when two sets of minion waves are stuck at a specific point in the lane. This happens when one set of minions slightly outnumbers the other set of minions. Now, the earliest this will happen is when there are 3 full HP range minions extra for one side. But if there are too many leftover minions, then the wave will eventually crash into the closest tower. So it's basically like having a wave resetting over and over in the same position. So how do you know what to do in each wave state? Well, the actual answer is, it depends, because other factors dictate what you want to do with the wave. So let's cover this lane state first. If you are the stronger champion, you want to slow the waves down as much as possible. Now, what does this mean? Well, this basically means just last hitting, or trying to thin the incoming wave so you can freeze it on your weaker opponent. Why is this the best choice instead of just hard shoving? Well, think about it from your opponent's point of view. They would much rather you push the minion wave closer to their tower, aka their safety, quicker. They don't want to have to run away from their safety to the last hit minions because you are ready for them. Your goal is to make the lane as difficult as possible. Remember chapter 1. But there comes a time when you want to shove or crash the wave, even if you are the stronger champion. It's important to note here that a sequence of minion waves will always end in a crash or hard shove into a tower. The key is timing it to perfection. So when is that time? Well, the ideal shove or crash is one that creates a bounce back to the middle of the lane for the next wave. So this happens when you kill the enemy minions quick enough for your own minions to die to that tower before the next wave reaches the lane. This means that next wave has breathing room to come out and reach the middle of the lane. It's not getting held up or blocked. Because you push this line back to the middle, the enemy champion has to play the game further away from their safety. I also call this a clean crash. If you dirty crash that wave, so you don't shove it quick enough and the next wave gets held up under the tower, then this usually just creates a slow push for your opponent and their minions will shortly outnumber yours, giving them an advantage in regards to that lane variable. Obviously, you never want this as the stronger champion, so you are looking for a clean crash. Now, there are 3 questions to ask yourself. The first question to ask yourself is, do I have the power to quickly kill these minions? So, for example, champions with excellent wave clear like Aurelia, Ryze, Yasuo, Sivir, Xayah, Karma, most of the time that answer is going to be yes. If you're playing a champion like Fiora, Shen, LeBlanc, Twitch, Zeri, Blitzcrank, most of the time that answer is going to be no. The second question, or even requirement you could say for clean crashing, is the position of the minion wave. If it is on the opponent's side of the lane, so let's say from 60% of the lane onwards, this generally is close enough to the enemy tower to crash, so the tower will kill your minions before the next wave reaches the lane. If it is not at that 60% line, even if it's just a little bit beyond the middle of the lane, it becomes harder to clean crash. For sure, you can still crash it, but it will almost always be a dirty crash. The last question here revolves around minion numbers. Do you have a significant surplus in minions? Does your wave significantly outnumber the enemy wave? Because to really clean crash, your minions have to help you out too. So the bigger the surplus, the harder that shove will be. For example, at level 1, a champion like Aurelia, if she starts Q, can probably shove the wave even though the wave is in the middle of the lane. But the minion wave is 6v6. It would be a lot easier if it was 6v3 or 12v6. But in saying all of that, there are situations in which you don't care if you clean crash the wave or dirty crash the wave. If you want to dive the enemy champion in the next 10 seconds, you would shove the wave in the next 10 seconds. If you just last hit the wave, the enemy team has longer to react to a potential dive. Another situation might involve a roam timer. So a fight might have started at Dragon, and you have no kill threat on the enemy champion, so you just shove the wave earlier than perhaps you should to get to that fight quicker. The last exception revolves around your resources, your HP and mana. You might be so low on HP and mana that last hitting one wave and shoving the next is too long. Other enemy champions like the jungler might have too much time to make a play on you, so you would shove that initial wave and get out of there ASAP. But not always are you going to be the stronger champion. I mean, you should be after executing this course's exercises. So what do we do when we are the weaker champion though? Well, if I was to ask you, do you want to lane for longer than you have to against a stronger champion? The answer is going to be no, unless you're getting paid. So your goal with minion waves is to speed them up. Yes, you could slow push or just last hit, but if you are not as strong as your opponent, that minion advantage won't really mean anything. They can still fight you and kill you. So I'm going to give you the best example for this. This technique is called creating a surplus. In this game, Sam the Set is behind the enemy Olaf, which means in terms of wave management, we don't want to be in lane for longer than we have to be. We want to speed things up. So when the wave resets in this position, because it's 7 minions versus 7 minions, it is still going to end up pushing away from Sam. The reason for this is because it's reset on his side of the lane. Can you see how the blue minions are in formation already? There are still red minions waiting to deal damage. So essentially what this is pushing away. And whenever this happens, you should be thinking about the crash timing, because you have to eventually. So what wave do you want to shove into the enemy tower. Now, because we are behind in this lane, and the enemy jungler on top of that could come gank us, given that our lane is pushing towards the stronger Olaf, we want to crash this next wave. It doesn't matter if it's clean or dirty, just crash the wave so you don't die. So what Sam has to do is create a surplus of minions. Sometimes the game will just do it for you. You will have 5 extra minions and you can just crash the wave. But here it's way too even, and the enemy champion is too strong for us to crash the wave how it is right now. So Sam has to auto-attack the red minions so he has a big surplus of minions. This will actually help him shove the next wave without Olaf being able to headbutt him, because the minion wave will be too big. Sam did not know this tech at the time, which is perfectly fine of course, but simply slow pushing here is not enough, and it's a big factor in why Olaf is able to contest the wave and eventually kill him again. Another important point around shoving minion waves is to follow the wave into the enemy tower. After you kill the last minion, walk the wave into the tower. Killing the last minion is not the end of the job. The job is complete once the minions are under the enemy tower. Way too many players kill the last minion and just run off, when the enemy champion can threaten to hold up the wave and freeze it. Now, the final factor to consider is the map state. Because you might want to recall so badly, you're low HP, you have gold, you just crashed the wave, just like this game we looked at with Zhao Chao Meng playing Gangplank against this low HP Darius. Now, just before this, they killed the enemy Lee Sin, who pathed from bot to top side of the map. So understanding map state is actually just about understanding the champion numbers and where every enemy champion is. So for example, Zhao Chao Meng, because he knows he's in a 1v1 here, because Lee Sin just died, he can actually stay here and 1v1 the Darius. And you can apply this, guys, with any champion. If the enemy support has roamed mid, and you've seen them on the minimap, if you're in a 2v1 bot lane, you can stay. If you think the enemy jungler is running to their red buff, because it's respawning in about 10 seconds time, as a bot lane, you probably know that you're going to be in a 2v2 if you end up fighting. The map state is just about champion numbers, and sometimes this will have a big sway on you actually recalling or not. Chapter 9, Communication. Whether you like it or not, you are part of a team, and any high-performing team is going to high-perform because they have sound communication. The Rift is no different. Yes, we are placing emphasis on winning your matchup and focusing on that, but when information needs to be communicated, you communicate it to your teammates. So what types of information do you need to communicate to your team? That's a question we will soon answer, but the most important type of communication on League is something I call preemptive communication. Most players use the tools of communication at their disposal, so the chat and their pings, sometimes for the worst, but when someone on their own team misplays or they misplay, it usually comes after something has happened. Like they only communicate it in hindsight. This is of no real use because you can't change the past. You can, however, change the future. Look at these quotes, bro, I'm coming out with. So if you think your jungler can gank your lane, let's just say, because the enemy champion has no flash, then communicate that information as early as possible. The number of times I've seen a laner complain about their jungler never ganking when they never even told their jungler about their situation, like it kind of tilts me. Your jungler and the rest of your teammates cannot see what you're doing and your opponent is doing 24/7. It's impossible. So don't leave them in the dark. Now, the reason I've mentioned your jungler a lot here is because they are the heartbeat of a team. Their job is to assess all the information given to them by the map, scoreboard, camera, and their teammates, and then to make the best decision based on that information. But again, if you don't give your jungler that info and the rest of your team, you are withholding information, you are committing treason, and you will be hunted down by the state. But what type of information are we preemptively communicating? And how do we go about communicating that info? The first big one is cooldowns, and this doesn't just mean your own key spells, like your ultimate at level 6, or if you're LeBlanc and your E is on cooldown but your jungler doesn't know, or you're a Blitzcrank and your Q is ready but your AD carry doesn't know. This also means the cooldowns of your opponents, and I'm also not talking about just their abilities, also their summoner spells. Pretty much anything on your HUD and their HUD, you want to communicate as soon as is necessary. And notice what I said there, as soon as it's necessary. You're not going to type in chat Syndra no Q each time she uses her Q, but if your jungler is nearby and that Syndra doesn't have her E, for example, you should definitely type no E. You are feeding them that key information. So how do you communicate cooldowns? Well, if it's your own ability or summoner spell, you can just hover over it with your mouse and alert ping. That time will appear in chat for your team. If it's your opponent's cooldowns, then you have to type in chat. Yes, I know what a chore that is, but it's quick and easy once you get used to it. It is a skill, and as a jungle jungle main myself, I love it when someone is telling me in chat the important information I need to play optimally. So press enter and just type what your enemy does not have. For example, Fiora, no W, Jhin, no flash. You don't even probably have to type the champion because the jungler will know who you're playing against. And if that is the case, you can probably just type no W, no E, depending on the champion you're against, of course. This preemptive communication is constant in Challenger. That's one of the reasons it's Challenger. So if you do this more and more, you will win more. The next one is something I call fight timers. And this is what it sounds like. The time at which you want to fight with your teammate or teammates. Do you want to fight the enemy bot lane as soon as you hit level 2 first? Do you want your jungler to gank mid lane when your opponent goes for a certain minion? Do you want to fight the enemy team who just started the dragon? These fight timers are active plays. You are probably going to end up fighting the enemy champions, so we need an active form of communication. All you have to do to get this intention across is on my way ping. So simply open up your ping wheel and flick your mouse to the right. This tells your teammates you want to fight. You can also just standard ping your own minions because this will tell your jungler, let's go, when they walk up for this minion. Another subtle way of giving across this I want to fight vibe is to ping the champion you want to fight. In other words, target selection. This is very important in these micro situations. So if you're playing Nautilus support, for example, you don't want to hook the enemy AD carry for your own AD carry to go on the enemy support. You want to ping that target before you go in, because this gives you the best possible chance of coordinating your damage and maximizing your chances to get kills, and therefore golden experience. Now, a big one here that is done so lazily by most players is tracking. And you can think of this as roaming, but tracking around the map, I just prefer to call it that. It just sounds more specific, more purposeful. Now, this applies to yourself. While you shove your wave and you want to track or roam somewhere afterwards, you should on my way ping that information well before actually doing it. But this tracking idea is most powerful when you apply it to your opponent. What I mean is this: if the enemy mid laner goes missing, that is the most generic phrase I've ever heard. And the funny thing, if I was to ask that player where have they gone missing, they probably know, but all they do is ping missing in their lane, and that's it. This is incredibly lazy and not helpful for the most part. You have to track that roam. You have to track that movement like you're a police dog. Where is your opponent leaving their tracks? Is the enemy top laner a Pantheon who can ult bot lane at a base? Is the enemy mid laner moving towards your bot lane because they hovered the bot side of mid while they were shoving the wave? Is the enemy support moving towards your jungler doing dragon? Now, how do you communicate this info? Well, through pings, of course, and you can type as well. The more the merrier when it comes to communicating and tracking. And these pings can either be missing pings, danger pings, or careful pings. But if you want to separate yourself from the average Joe, ping the areas in which the enemy champion will eventually be. Don't ping where they actually went missing from. They go missing to go somewhere else. Where's the somewhere else? You are pinging the B in the A to B distance equation. Now, vision. The last big type of information to communicate about is vision. Now, this goes without saying that if you know the enemy champion is warded somewhere, you should ping it. And in the next chapter, I will elaborate on vision, so I'll keep it simple for now. To communicate that the enemy has placed a ward somewhere, all you have to do is use the hotkey for area is warded ping in your communication hotkeys, and Bob's your uncle. Easy as. Chapter 10, Vision and Warding. Now, I hate playing against players who ward well. But what does this mean, ward well? Let me answer it for you. Warding is about 3 factors: the when, the where, and the how. So let's tackle each of these. When do you ward? Well, to know the answer to this question, first we have to answer the why we ward question. So why do we place wards? Most of the time, it's to scout for the enemy jungler or an enemy champion who might be roaming. We're not putting a trinket in a river brush, for example, because we get turned on by placing wards. Now, there are some other instances, and I will get into them, but that's generally what we're using wards for. So when do we want to scout for the enemy jungler with our ward? Well, the answer is, it depends on the type of enemy jungler. You don't ward the same against a Jarvan as you do against an Evelynn, for example. So the type of jungler is a huge factor, and there are only 2 of them: level 2 gankers and level 3 gankers. I could put another category, level 4 gankers, or champions who only full clear, but any jungler can gank at level 3, with all 3 of their basic abilities, any of them. You just have to figure out if you can actually get level 2 red buff ganked or not, and that's it. Easy. So if you are playing against a J4, a Lee Sin, a Nidalee, a Graves, a Shaco, warding before the first wave is critical, so around the 120 timer. And you would ward anywhere around this area, because this would mean if they level 2 gank you, they are going to appear on this vision. But if you're playing against a level 3 ganker like a Sejuani, a Rammus, a Zac, a Kayn, a Zenzao, a Rek'Sai, warding during the second wave or before the third wave is a must, so around the 215 timer. And again, I would highly recommend warding the enemy Red Raptors side, because that is likely where they are going to gank you from. So now we know when to ward, but what about where? Well, like I just said, you want to be warding towards that area you're most likely going to get ganked from, but again, this will depend on the type of enemy jungler you're against. Junglers with mobility like Nidalee, Kindred, Graves, Rek'Sai can gank you from different angles, whereas linear junglers like Hecarim, Nocturne, Rengar can only gank you from one or two angles. So let me quickly cover warding spots for each lane. Top lane. For blue side, these spots are great against mobile junglers, and these spots are great for linear junglers. For red side, these spots are great against mobile junglers, and these spots are great for linear junglers. Mid lane, for blue and red side, these spots are always great. You cover the Raptor gank and also the River gank. For bot lane, these spots are great for blue side against mobile junglers, and these spots are great for linear junglers. For red side, these spots are great against mobile junglers, and these spots are great for linear junglers. But one nuance not enough players think about is how you ward these areas. Most players will ward these areas on vision. In other words, they will be last hitting minions, then run to that warding area. This is so obvious. If you are warding at level 1, you can easily stay in fog until 120 and place that ward down without anyone seeing you, most likely. And if you want to ward towards the end of the second wave, you can start a step towards that location instead of just going towards it head first. So that's the first point. The next point is when you come back to lane. Most of the time you'll have purchased a control ward or your trinket is replenished, but 99% of players show on the minion wave first and then go to ward. Try to ward before showing on vision to the enemy team. Unless, of course, you are going to miss a lot of minions for it. Now, this is powerful because they don't know if you've warded. And it's not just your lane opponent, it's the enemy jungler, the enemy support, everyone. And the next level to this is to conceal where you warded from. So try to show yourself in a neutral position, not a deliberate position. In other words, try to show yourself in the middle of the lane. This makes it close to impossible to deduce whether or not you have warded before showing. Now, of course, as the game progresses, you will have more time to ward because champions clear waves faster, so you can ward deeper. And actually on jungle camps or over gromp pools or in any jungle brush, you can also ward your lane itself. For example, in mid lane, if you're playing against a big roaming champion like a Twisted Fate, a Talon, a Ryze, putting a ward down on their side of the lane is very effective. For bot lane, you might consider warding the lane brushes for brush control, or because you suspect the enemy jungler might be lane ganking instead. Same for top lane. But there is one exception here. Sometimes the level 1 and level 2 in your lane might be so volatile, you need to ward one of the lane brushes. This is fine. It's much better to ward for a big lane advantage that might result in a kill or denying the enemy top lane minions or even waves than to not get a big advantage. What happens a lot of the time, if this is the case, is that you will build up such a big minion wave that you can actually 1v2 or 2v3 the enemy laner, or laners and their jungler. But this is not the only type of vision control, placing trinkets and control wards. Using red sweepers is a big part of the vision game too, and you want to be using it around these popular warding areas, especially if you're going to roam around the map. You want to know if the enemy team can see you. The unseen threat is the deadliest. As to the question, when do I swap to a sweeper? Well, if your trinket is on cooldown for a long time, let's say at least 100 seconds, you can get a sweeper unless you are an AD carry. A trinket is essential because your support will swap to a sweeper and you will only have control wards for actual vision. Now, some general warding tricks. One trick is to press tab each time your opponent shows back on the map. Do they have a control ward? And what type of trinket do they have? If you see them with a control ward in their inventory and they go missing and then return to lane without it, you can probably tell where they have put it, and you make that 75 gold they spent on it completely useless. The same goes for their body language when they place warding totems. The yellow trinket. If someone walks straight towards a brush or common jungle pathing area and runs back to lane, they have probably warded that brush or area. But this goes for your teammates as well. If you press tab and see that they have a ward, you can ping it and ask it to be placed. Guys, that was the laning course. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it and learned some stuff. We'll talk soon. This has been Eagz.